magic in the air. Aye, וכל הגוף פועל. Aye, feel the magic in the air. Aye, וכל הגוף פועל. Aye, feel the magic in the air.
חצות, כולם רוקדים ברחובות, את שם בתוך השיגעון, רוקדת לא עושה חשבון, וזה כבר לא נורמלי, מה שאת עושה לי, בא לי להעיר עכשיו את כל העיר, וזה כבר לא נורמלי, מה שאת עושה לי, יש משהו באוויר, feel the magic in the air. הדור הבוקר אנחנו עושים Feel the magic in the air Feel the magic in the air עלה וכל הגוף בוער עלה Feel the magic in the air עלה וכל הגוף בוער עלה
The magic in the air. וכל הגוף פועל.
Good evening. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our New England and Capital Region Tree of Life event honoring Ken and Nancie Segel. Although we are coming together in the virtual world, I can only imagine how wonderful it would be if we were all in a room together mingling and getting to know one another and seeing friendly faces and familiar faces. For those of you that haven't had the pleasure of meeting me, my name is Eric Larner, and it is my honor to chair this event because Ken is not only my business partner, but Ken and Nancie are like true family to me. I again welcome you all to this wonderful event. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the generous support of this evening's sponsors. Your support is very much appreciated. Many people do not realize that the Jewish National Fund USA is an organization led by volunteer ambassadors, lay leaders, just like Ken and Nancie Segel. As a JNF ambassador, you do not just donate your philanthropic dollars, but your time, energy, and effort in creating a beautiful future for the people and land of Israel. Ken and Nancie are a perfect example of this. I hope you will all enjoy the evening together, celebrating Nancie and Ken for their impactful support and dedication to the Jewish National Fund USA.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome to our Jewish National Fund USA Tree of Life Gala, honoring Ken and Nancie Segel. The fact that so many of you have joined us this evening to acknowledge the contributions of this philanthropic power couple only pays further testament to the impact and legacy they have had and continue to have on communities across the U.S. and Israel.
Jewish National Fund USA Tree of Life Award is our organization's highest humanitarian honor that recognizes a recipient's outstanding community involvement, their dedication to the cause of American-Israeli friendship, and their devotion to peace and the security of human life. As the leading philanthropic organization for Israel, we are truly blessed to enjoy Ken and Nancie's support, leadership, and generosity that has benefited so many.
Jewish National Fund USA supports critical environmental and nation-building activities in Israel's north and south. Through our $1 billion roadmap for the next decade, We are developing new communities in the Negev and Galilee, connecting the next generation to Israel and creating infrastructure and programs that support ecology, individuals with special needs, and heritage site preservation.
As some of you may know, Ken and Nancie's first learned of Jewish National Fund USA's work through our Small Communities campaign. As a JNF USA ambassador, or donor, like so many of you, was given the wonderful opportunity to help meet prospective donors in Albany. Everyone mentioned the same thing. You've got to meet Ken Segel.
It was only a short time later on a trip with our organization's CEO, Russell Robinson, to the fortified Sderot Indoor Recreation Center that really got Ken and Nancie on board and involved. Seeing Israeli children who had been living under difficult circumstances who were now able to play, run freely, and simply be kids without the fear of falling under missile attacks moved Ken and Nancie to action. Fast forward to the present day, and Ken serves with distinction as our Vice President of Communities and Regions.
In his role as a Jewish National Fund USA ambassador, Ken has also held prior positions of leadership within Jewish National Fund USA, including Vice President of Campaign, Vice President of Israeli Relations Council, as well as National Chairman of Major Gifts and President of the organization's Capital Region Board.
He's also a proud member of the World Chairman's Council, King Solomon Society, and Gould Legacy Society. However, Ken's personal connection to Israel spans back much further after he fell in love with the country and its people during a college semester abroad in Tel Aviv in 1970.
After returning to the United States and marrying his wonderful wife, Nancie, who also came from a family with a strong Jewish identity, he committed himself to making Israel a better place for its citizens. He has always been involved with Jewish community causes, having served on the boards of the Jewish Federation, his local synagogue, nursing homes, and day schools. As the principal of Latham-based Schuyler Companies, which focuses on retail, office, and warehouse real estate, Ken knows about the challenge of building something new. Perhaps it is unsurprising that his latest Jewish National Fund USA project is all about creating something groundbreaking.
As the co-chair of the campaign to build our unprecedented World Zionist Village in Beersheba, Ken previously explained why this project is so dear to him and Nancie. Ken said, and I quote, "I love the idea of being part of building something that is going to be around for generations, that will preserve and promote a love of Zion. With the village, we can be part of doing that on a global scale."
And like Ken, Nancie has made her own mark on the Jewish and Zionist world. The daughter of Holocaust survivors, Nancie has continued to demonstrate how she is, as she says, a lover of everything Israel. She is someone who turns words into action and action into impact.
When Nancie says she is going to do something, she doesn't just get it done. She also brings others along with her. Today, Nancie serves on our Capital Region Board and is also a proud member of Jewish National Fund USA's Sapphire Society, Circle of Sapphire, World Chairman Society, King Solomon Society, and the Gould Legacy Society.
You know, they say family is everything, and Ken and Nancie's 2 daughters and 2 grandchildren are a testament to their success as they continue to suffuse their lives with a love of Israel, spending time in the Holy Land, and connecting to their own local Jewish communities.
Yet the Segels have also shown their unwavering support for another family, the Jewish National Fund family. They have always been there for us. They have given us their time, resources, and expertise. But most importantly, they have given us their passion. They have communicated that passion to others. And in doing so, they have grown and enriched the JNF family. Ken has inspired scores of people to take up leadership roles in JNF, not only in the Capital Region, where he grew the board and recruited 3 presidents, but also throughout the country during his tenure in various JNF portfolios.
If you were to open Webster's dictionary and look up the word generous, you would see a photo of Ken and Nancie. Because of them, our organization is more successful, more impactful, and more effective than ever before.
Through their actions, they inspire us and so many other philanthropists around the country to dig deep in support of the land and people of Israel and Jewish people everywhere.
As Ken and Nancy continue to lead our great movement and the broader philanthropic community, there are few more deserving of Jewish National Fund USA's highest honor than these two wonderful people.
As some of you may know, I served as the Jewish National Fund emissary to New England. We started the small community campaign, and once we arrived in Albany, everybody mentioned the same thing. You have got to meet Ken Segel. From the first meeting with Ken and Nancie, it was a pleasure to share with them the Jewish National Fund work for the benefit of the people in Israel. It was only a short time later on a trip with our organization CEO, Russell Robinson, to the Sderot Indoor Recreation Center that really got Ken and Nancie on board and involved.
Congratulations.
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 Congratulations and
And
Mazal
Mazel
Tov
Tov on this
So
Richly
richly
deserved
deserved
award.
First of all, we want to congratulate our parents on being named Tree of Life recipients, JNF USA's highest honor. Their devotion to building the Jewish community has been a lifelong endeavor, and because of this, they are both so deserving of this recognition.
When we look back at our parents' years of commitment to JNF and their general outlook on Jewish philanthropy, there appears a consistent theme of devotion. What does it mean? One definition is love, loyalty, or enthusiasm for a person, activity, or cause. Another definition is the act of giving as time or effort to something. We believe that devotion is the core of our father's motivation to live as a father, husband, businessman, and philanthropist. Also, our mother, whose parents were brave Holocaust survivors, Nancie demonstrated a strong drive to make Jewish children and support the Jewish community.
Both of our parents have always been devoted to connecting us to our Jewish identity, for which we are so grateful. We attended Hebrew Academy and youth organizations in our local community. During summer breaks, we always went to Jewish camps and frequently visited Israel as a family. They built and fostered a strong connection to Israel, which they pass along to us, and we plan to continue this with the next generation. As the years passed, it became clear that this was part of an overarching theme of dedication to the continuity of the Jewish people.
When we think about why they chose to ingrain themselves within the JNF community, it is grounded in the idea that the success of the Jewish homeland is in part a product of its maintenance and growth. JNF projects maintain many of the most historic and beautiful locations throughout the country. JNF also helps Israel and the Jewish people grow trees, housing, employment opportunities, hospitals, and community centers. We recall a conversation when our father took on a new role as National Vice President of Campaign. He said, "Girls, if you really want to make an impact, you have to have the right tools to make change." JNF is his toolbox to execute his devotion, and with the support of his loving wife, it has been one of their lifelong successes. We could not be more proud.
What we have learned through their generosity and commitment to JNF is that being passively supportive is not sufficient. We must be active supporters of Jewish culture and the Jewish homeland. I can recall after the Carmel forest fires that our father was in Israel. He toured around seeing the damage firsthand. Now he serves as the national co-chair of the New World Zionist Village in Beersheba, lending his expertise for this linchpin project, which will change the world for the better. It will serve as an ecosystem of Zionist engagement, and our father's name will be attached to it forever.
Each time our parents are in Israel, they get that sparkle in their eye that you see when a child tries ice cream for the first time. Maybe it's just the hummus effect, but they seem to have really found their hearts in the Jewish homeland. We're so honored to be their daughters and watch them dedicate both their time and generosity to JNF USA projects. Thank you.
Ken, Nancie, what can I say? You so richly deserve this honor, as you are both such wonderful ambassadors of Jewish National Fund USA and role models for our next generation. Although Lauren and I wish we could be there in person tonight, I know that you will both remember this special honor for the rest of your lives. And just like our own Tree of Life Award, it will surely hang proudly in your home, just like it does in ours. Ken, you're a longtime Zionist, and your leadership and contribution to our movement is beyond measure. Everyone who knows you appreciates how hard you work and the creativity you bring to every situation. Every time you have headed up a task force, mission, board, or special project, you have always achieved success, no matter what. And now, as you co-chair our boldest, most impactful project to date, the World Zionist Village, you're helping to shape an initiative that will impact the entire Jewish world. And Nancie, they say that behind every successful man is a woman. However, you have not only stood behind Ken, you have also been at his side and in front, charting your own course on our Capital Region Board and as a proud member of our Sapphire Society. Like Ken, you consistently demonstrate sound judgment and an ability to develop new ideas that propel our organization forward. Thanks to both of you, Jewish National Fund USA is stronger, more resilient, and more impactful than ever before. Mazel tov, and congratulations on receiving this auspicious award.
Good evening. My name is Russell Robinson, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Jewish National Fund USA. And tonight, I have the honor, I have the privilege of presenting the Tree of Life Award to Nancie and Ken Segel. The Tree of Life Award is one of our top honors that we have given to prime ministers and presidents, senators, philanthropists from throughout the world. And tonight, two more deserving people could not be better than Nancie and Ken. You know, I've had the opportunity of being with them on really their first kind of connection to the Jewish National Fund. We were in Ammunition Hill on Yom HaAtzmaut, celebrating Israel's independence. I have to say they were there with another organization, but our two organizations are all about Israel, and we were sitting together. Ken had just started his involvement in Albany, where we had no organization, but he helped bring it along. He joined McCore. And from those meetings, he brought the better half, Nancie, along with him. And together, they have taken hundreds of people to Israel, have given them the opportunity to experience our land and our people. You won't find two people who have a family also that connects to Israel from their involvement in our Jewish National Fund, JNF Future, to even living in Israel and even helping us plan out a business plan for Ammunition Hill when we were starting to do our fundraising and really looking at it to making it an international site. I have to tell you, I work with both of them. I have Ken who can make 1,000 phone calls a day. I don't know how it happens. Or you could bring Nancie into a meeting and there is an event and all of a sudden conversation is happening. Two people who've devoted their life to building a stronger Jewish world. They've devoted their life to building a stronger connection between the land and people of Israel and the Jewish people everywhere. Through your commitment, yes, financially, but your commitment in your heart, in your family, in your love, no two people are more deserving of this honor than Nancie and Ken. So I am proud, as the Chief Executive Officer tonight, to be presenting you with our most prestigious honor, the Tree of Life of the Jewish National Fund. Nancie and Ken, thank you.
Good evening, friends. Thank you for joining us tonight. My wife, Nancie, and I are deeply honored to accept Jewish National Fund USA's highest recognition, represented by this Tree of Life Award. This honor means so much to us, and I feel symbolizes our work in support of our Jewish community and Israel. All of our efforts on behalf of philanthropic causes has been made to ensure a brighter future for our daughters and granddaughters and for the future generations we may never meet. I hope that by coming together tonight, they will continue to be inspired by what the power of philanthropy can achieve. As many of you know, I grew up in a secular Jewish household, and it wasn't until 1971 when I spent a year abroad at Tel Aviv University that something in me stirred. It was this incredible, indescribable connection to my heritage and history. Israel was very different back then. The country's economy was based on agriculture and tourism. There was no high-tech scene in Tel Aviv or revolutionary water research and development in the Negev. It was by and large an agrarian society, and its greatest export was the Jaffa orange. What struck me most was the fact that Jews were relying on no one else but themselves. There were Jewish farmers, shopkeepers, taxi drivers, police officers, construction workers, and so much more. For centuries, our people were barred from so many professions. Yet what I saw in Israel was like a utopian society. Not in the sense that everything was perfect, it certainly wasn't, but that we had realized a 2,000-year-old dream, our right to self-determination. This is what Zionism looks like. When I returned to the US following my study abroad experience in Israel, I knew that I needed to become more involved. After graduating law school and returning to Albany, I became involved with our Jewish Federation, Daughters of Sarah Nursing Home, Israel Bonds, and the Hebrew Academy. At age 43, I became our Federation president. And I believe I was one of the youngest people ever to hold that office. That type of thing wouldn't have happened in a larger community. I feel blessed to have lived in such a wonderful, close-knit community like the Capital Region. I guess you could say that my journey with Jewish National Fund began through our friend Melinda Wolf from Maryland, who was serving as the liaison for our small community. She was partnering with the professional team in Boston. Fast forward, we happened to be in Israel for its 60th Independence Day celebration. Through a series of unexpected events, Melinda brought us to a Jewish National Fund USA event where we met CEO Russell Robinson. The next thing we knew, we were in our hotel lobby with him and talking about our vision for Israel late into the night. 6 months later, we were back in Israel on our first of many JNF missions. From that moment on, my involvement with the organization grew from local to national. I went on President's missions, joined McCore, and later served as National Major Gifts Chairman, National Vice President of Campaign, Vice President of the Israel Relations Council, and am currently Vice President of Communities and Regions. Today, Nancy and I continue to give our time in multiple ways as members of Jewish National Fund USA's World Chairman's Council and King Solomon Society. I'm also a member of the Capital District and Miami Boards of Directors and President Emeritus of the Capital District Board. One of the most important projects I'm now part of is an initiative that will impact the entire Jewish world and spark a new conversation about the future of Zionism. I am, of course, referring to Jewish National Fund USA's planned World Zionist Village in Beersheba. When I was asked to co-chair the campaign for this visionary project, of course, I said yes. As someone who appreciates the value and importance of Jewish education, I believe that the future leaders of our people will discover their Zionist identity and connection to Israel at Jewish National Fund USA's World Zionist Village. These are the same people who will not only serve as leaders of JNF USA, but will be the leaders in other organizations that support Israel. For example, federations, JCCs, and synagogues, for the next 50 years and beyond. By investing in this project, I know that I am impacting not just JNF and not just Israel, but rather the entire Jewish world, helping to create the kind of world which I want to leave for future generations. And although Nancie and I are proud to have made philanthropic investments to support Israel's firefighters, the Sderot Playground, Nefesh B'Nefesh, and even JNF's flagship building in New York, the World Zionist Village will really be like nothing our community has ever seen before. As I stand here before you to accept this honor, I couldn't have done any of it without my wonderful wife, Nancie, whom I will allow, as always, to have the last word.
Well, thank you, Ken. That was wonderful. You managed to get through it, and it was very sweet. Friends, this award means so much to Ken and I. As the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, I have always had a strong sense of what it means to be a Jew. I've been involved with several philanthropic causes, including JNF, with my lovely husband here. He's the one who got me in this. And the other fun thing about the JNF was I met so many wonderful people like Melinda. We went to visit Israel many, many times, and it was delightful. I have lost count of how many times I have traveled to Israel with Ken, yet every time we arrive at Ben Gurion Airport, I feel like I have come home again, and a feeling of connection that is so unique. I look back on everything we have done and achieved at JNF with pride, knowing that we're really part of it. And I know that our children and our children's children, my little grandbabies, are delicious, will continue to benefit from the support we have given to Israel and Jewish causes in our local community for generations to come. In that spirit, Ken and I feel so deeply honored to accept this award. And we've met so many wonderful people through this, and that's wonderful also. And we thank all for joining us this evening and celebrating.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my distinct privilege to welcome a journalist who has shown great courage and determination in exposing the media's bias against Israel. His writing has been praised around the world, and his books regularly are featured on top 10 bestseller lists. Notably, his last book, Spies of No Country, explores Israel's intelligence agents and received the 2019 Natan Book Award. He's also a contributor to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and other publications. Friends, please join me in welcoming this fearless journalist, Matti Friedman.
Interviewing Matti Friedman is Dar Nadler, Jewish National Fund USA's Israel emissary in New England and the Capital District of New York. Dar formerly served as the CEO of Blue White Future, a prominent Israeli political NGO established and led by former head of the Israeli Shin Bet. Prior to that, she served as senior advisor to the Minister of Defense, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. She was born and raised in a kibbutz, served in the IDF, and graduated from Tel Aviv University with a master's degree in public policy and conflict resolution.
Hi, Matti. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to speak with JNF USA, which does such great work here in Israel. And I know Dad and I see it all the time, whether it's forestry, water, work with people with disabilities, work in the Negev, work in the Galil, which is close to my heart because it's where my parents live. It's a special pleasure to be speaking to you guys. And particularly, I want to say congratulations to Ken and Nancie for the Tree of Life Award, which is very prestigious and special. So thank you so much for inviting me to come.
You previously wrote, "The world is not responding to events in this country, but rather to the description of these events by news organizations." Can you please elaborate on what you meant and maybe tell us how, as Zionists, what can we do?
I think that it's important for people to be able to differentiate between reality in Israel and the stories that are told about Israel in most of the media that Westerners and particularly Americans tend to consume. We, me and you, that we have the luxury of being able to see Israel just by opening our window or walking out into the street. But people who don't live here, of course, need to hear about it secondhand. And the secondhand stories, sometimes they're ridiculously positive and sometimes they're ridiculously negative. but they're often ridiculous in many different ways. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and to know that when you're reading a story in a newspaper or seeing it on TV, you're getting a highly filtered version of reality. And there's often an ideological element where someone is trying to convince you of something, and often that motive is obscured. So I think people need to be suspicious. They need to be careful consumers of all media, and particularly media about Israel, because this is such an inflamed political topic, and there are so many different political motivations in play. I take everything that I read with a grain of salt, and I always remind myself that if I can get on a plane and come to Israel, I'll see something completely different than what I've just read in the newspaper. And I always encourage people to keep that in mind. Whether it's a story that seems incredibly good or incredibly bad, probably the reality in Israel looks very, very different. And I would say that to any reader, but particularly people who are Zionists, people who feel deep sympathy with Israel, which is true of our audience tonight. It's very important to remember. Often this kind of coverage that we get is upsetting and annoying, and you can kind of get swept away by it. And it's always worth remembering that if you just get on a plane, land in Tel Aviv, you'll probably see something completely different.
That's very true. So sometimes, though, it's not only about what the press gets wrong in their reporting. It's about what they deliberately omit from their stories. Can you tell us about some important stories that were never covered or even buried if a reporter dared to bring them in?
My window into all of this is my experience as an AP reporter. I was a correspondent and an editor in the AP bureau here between 2000 and the end of 2011. And that's really the heart of the international press set up here in Israel. And at the time, it was the AP's biggest international bureau, and the AP is the world's biggest news organization. So this is a story that is of incredible interest to people in the West, and Western news organizations allocate a lot of resources, disproportionately large resources, to covering this story, and yet so much is left out of the story, as you mentioned. And we can give little examples because many times in an individual news story, context will be left out. There won't be a coherent Israeli response to a charge that's being made. But I actually think that that what's being left out is much bigger. That the falsification of the Israel story doesn't really exist in the world of minor details that could be corrected in an individual article. Rather, it's in the huge issues of historical and geographical context. So I'll give you one obvious example: the idea that there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's the framing of the story that everyone accepts. That's the way Western media cover this story, and often it's the way we discuss the story. But of course, it's not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Most of Israel's wars haven't been against Palestinians. Israel has, unfortunately, fought wars against Jordanians and Iraqis and Egyptians and Syrians and Lebanese, and Israel's most potent enemy at the moment is Iran. The Iranians are not Palestinian. So clearly there's a big Middle Eastern conflict going on, one with many, many actors in it. And if you refer to it as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what you've obscured is the entire context in which the conflict is taking place. Now, if you claim that there's an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then what you have is a story where Israelis are more powerful, more numerous, more westernized, more militarized, and the other side much less so, which is true, by the way, if you frame it as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then obviously your readers' sympathies go to the other side because people want to be with the underdog. And when it's framed in that way, we are not the underdog, and it's hard to sympathize with us. If you frame it as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then our dilemmas become impossible to understand, because when Israelis look at their story, we're zoomed out to see a story about the Middle East. And if you ask an average Israeli what their family story is, I'm not sure what yours is, Doug, but maybe it sounds something like this. My father fought against the Syrians in 1973. My grandfather fought against the Jordanians in 1948. My grandmother is a Jew from Baghdad who got run out of Baghdad when the Muslim majority in Iraq ran out the Jews of Iraq in the early 1950s. That's a pretty standard Israeli story, and it has nothing to do with Palestinians. But if you don't understand that this is going on in the context of the Middle East, in which there are 6 million Jews and an Arab world that numbers 300 million people. If you zoom out even farther, the Islamic world numbers about 1.5 billion people, and in one corner of the region, there are 6 million Jews. If you don't understand that is the way we see it in Israel, then you can't understand our dilemmas or how we choose to solve them, even if the way we choose to solve our dilemmas is sometimes wrong. You won't even be able to understand those mistakes unless you understand all of that context that's been obscured in the news story.
Yeah, it's pretty much brings me to my next question, that it almost seems like the media has its own narrative when it comes to Israel, and only select facts which confirm that narrative are the ones which make the news. I'm wondering if you have, if you can share with us any misconceptions about Israel that, although might be false, are very much considered common knowledge.
I think that your observation is absolutely correct. And I think we should note that it's not just about Israel. We're talking about a broader problem in the press, and anyone who consumes press coverage, whether you're reading stuff coming from the right or from the left, people increasingly understand that what you're getting is a kind of political fantasy that's aimed at a certain information ecosystem, and it's designed to get you to act a certain way or vote a certain way. And there are fewer and fewer news outlets that are just trying to explain a complicated situation. That's true internally in American politics. I don't think we need to get into the details. And it's true of the Israel story, where reporters are looking for, often, not always, but often, is a powerful story with an emotional impact. And for that purpose, it doesn't really help to have a story with dozens of actors like the one I just described in the Middle East with, Iranians and Jordanians and Egyptians, and that's just too complicated. A good news story has two actors, if possible, a good guy and a bad guy. One of the reasons that the current story in Ukraine is so powerful is because it has that. It's two actors, one good and one bad, and that allows a very easy emotional identification. Basically, I think what people want is a kind of bedtime story. They want a story about a princess and a dragon. And as close as you can get to that, the more powerful a news story you'll have. And the Israel story is really engineered in that way. It's not engineered to explain, it's engineered to kind of punch you in the gut and get you to support a certain side. So much is left out and warped in the story. I'm just going to throw out one aspect of our story, which I think is the most important and also maybe the hardest to understand for many Jews who, like me, grew up in communities in North America. When we grow up learning about Israel, we learn a very European story about Israel. So we have a story about Herzl in Vienna and pogroms in Eastern Europe and the socialist idea, the kibbutz idea, and of course the Holocaust, the Shoah, is very large in that story. And then we have the heroes of Israeli independence, David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, and that's a very European story. I came to Israel in 1995 from Toronto and discovered that those stories don't actually explain Israel. And there are many reasons that that's the case, but one of the main reasons is that at least half of the Jews in Israel have roots in the Islamic world and not in Europe. And I'm not even talking about the 1/5 of Israeli citizens who are Arab Muslims. I'm just looking at the Jewish majority. At least half of the Jews here have roots in places like Baghdad or Casablanca or Tunis or Damascus or Yemen. And those stories are completely different than the stories that we grew up with, which are stories about Eastern Europe and places like Warsaw and Vienna. Without understanding that, it's impossible to understand Israel. It's impossible to understand Israeli culture. It's impossible to understand Israeli food, which doesn't really look like Jewish food as Americans understand Jewish food. And there are many other examples, but unless you understand, more importantly, unless you understand that aspect of Israel's national life, you can't understand that Israel is a native part of the Islamic world. It's not certainly not a colonialist project, and it's not even a group of East European refugees who are dumped into the Islamic world. Israel is, as much as it's a European story, it's a story about the Middle East. And it's a story about Jews in the Islamic world. And in some ways, it's a kind of minority revolt inside the Islamic world on the part of an oppressed minority from the Islamic world that kind of achieves independence in a very interesting way. And without understanding that, Israel makes no sense. And yet I grew up with none of it when I learned about Israel in Toronto. And I still think that it's quite distant to many observers, even observers who love Israel. So when I try to point out one thing that people miss, I always try to point out that one because I think it's the most important.
I very much agree with you. I'm wondering if when I'm speaking about things that kind of rooted as common knowledge about Israel, that we know that just fit the international narrative, the international media narrative, I'm wondering if would you agree that Israel being an apartheid state is one of these examples of something that got rooted as common knowledge, although it can't be further than the truth.
yes, I mean, I think that we're talking about simple stories that stick and kind of political goals that are disguised as journalism. And I think what you're seeing now with the apartheid label is a real push to kind of stick that to Israel. That's a good example of that. The world is unfortunately an unhappy place in many ways, and there are many kinds of inequality playing out in every country. Certainly that's true of the United States, but it's true, unfortunately, of many countries, and there are different kinds of discrimination and different kinds of inequality, and not everyone gets the same shot. And I think that's true of Israel too, right? We're a country of humans on planet Earth, and we have very deep flaws, and that's a human society, unfortunately, and we have to address those problems, and we don't always do a great job of addressing them. The problems start when people start pretending that Israel has a unique problem, or that it is uniquely worse than other countries, where a country like a dictatorship, for example, like Egypt, is not an apartheid state, but a democracy like Israel is, or the apartheid exists in Israel, but not in many American cities, which are functionally segregated along racial lines. That's when the problems start, when people imagine Jews as a kind of symbol of what's wrong in the world. That's an old Western problem. It's not, it takes us kind of out of the realm of journalism and into the realm of history and psychology, but there's a very old tendency over many centuries, of course, and this isn't new to anyone who's listening to us tonight. There's a tendency to illustrate problems in the world by zooming in on Jews. And the problems change over time. So it used to be greed or cowardice or anti-Christianity or racial impurity or cosmopolitanism or communism or capitalism. Right? There are many problems that have been illustrated by using Jews. People at present are preoccupied with problems of inequality. That's seen to be the major problem afflicting humanity. And by the way, I would agree that it is. But you can't escape the fact that the people who are being held up as the prime example of inequality, the only country that is currently being kind of condemned as an apartheid state, is the Jewish country. And I think that has very little to do with journalism and an attempt to analyze events on planet Earth, and a lot to do with a very old mental virus that has afflicted Western societies for a very long time.
Would you say that most of the media outlets are at this point completely biased against Israel, or can we still find some that are actually giving an honest report or an accurate report?
I think it is possible. I tend these days not to look at media outlets, but at individual reporters. There are certain reporters who I know what they're talking about and whose work I admire. But I think that we do have to be aware that most media outlets are no longer engaged in explanation. They're engaged in a kind of activism. And I'm not just saying that about the outlets on the left, what we would once have called the mainstream media, which is functionally today kind of left-wing activism, but it's true of media on the right too. It's just a different kind of activism. And what I would advocate for is not, pro-Israel media. I would advocate for a return to the kind of media that tried to explain what's going on in the world instead of trying to inflame people and mobilize them in favor of certain political ideologies. But that's clearly a losing battle, and that's clearly not where things are going. That old middle ground where people used to vote Republican or Democrat, but they would sit down in the evening and watch Ed Murrow or watch, the TV news and kind of agree on reality. And then people would draw different conclusions from that and act differently in their political lives, but they would agree on the reality that they're discussing. That world no longer exists, or it's eroding rapidly. And instead, people live inside these information ecosystems, which are designed to reinforce your own biases. And on the left side of that spectrum, unfortunately, one of the points of agreement, one of the strongest or the most powerful stories, one of the most powerful portrayals of a villain is the Israel story. We find ourselves in the position of being held up really as a villainous, kind of malevolent actor in a political morality play about power, maybe about race for Americans. Has nothing to do with what's actually going on here, but it's something that I think anyone who's trying to understand Israel needs to be aware of.
Well, you actually written about the changing role of the press and how the media has transitioned from simply reporting the news to becoming activists who are shaping events. I want to ask you and refer to that. How do you think the reporters in the Middle East see their role?
My experience in the press corps was quite a disappointing one. I went in kind of positively disposed, or maybe even naive about the American press. I've always been an Israeli of kind of left-wing political sympathies, so I did not expect to have any problems inside a mainstream American press organization, and I did. And I was surprised by that. And after fighting a losing battle about the coverage for a number of years, I realized that if I want to talk about reality as I see it, I can't do it from inside one of those organizations because they are not primarily motivated by describing reality. Instead, what I found was a kind of activism where the journalistic decisions were being made for reasons that were primarily political or kind of activist in their reasoning. So it wasn't like we described something in order to best explain complicated events. We were making decisions based on whether it served the political goals of the coverage. And I've given concrete examples of that in a few essays that I've written about this topic. I think getting into it might be a bit, take us a bit off course. It might take a bit too long, but there are specific stories that I saw killed by editors because they didn't serve the political narrative. Just as a broad observation, you'll almost never hear in mainstream press coverage about the Oslo peace process of the 1990s when Israel was trying very hard to strike a peace agreement with Palestinians. That never happened. That's been memory hold because it would suggest that Israel's actually tried to solve the problem in a kind of equitable way, which goes against the narrative. Another thing that's been memory hold is the Second Intifada. These years of incredible, horrific terrorism inside Israel that you certainly remember, and I remember suicide bombings on buses and cafes. I was a student at Hebrew University when Palestinians bombed the cafeteria at Hebrew University where I was studying Islamic studies. So we went through those years. It shapes Israel's political consciousness. It really kind of sets to what extent Israelis are willing to take risks for peace. Those events have been erased from press coverage. You'll never hear them mentioned, or very, very rarely hear them mentioned, because they would explain how Israelis think. And it would make us sound like we're kind of reasonable or logical, or at least comprehensible, even if we're wrong. So a lot has to be left out in order to pursue a kind of journalism that is basically activism. And I think, unfortunately, that today that's true of not all journalists operating in the Middle East, but most of them.
So let me ask you this. Do you think there is a place, though, for legit criticism on Israel in the media?
Of course there is. I mean, a journalist's job is to be knowledgeable about a certain story. You can't be knowledgeable about all stories, contrary to what some Western journalists think. But your job is to know a story really, really well and explain it as well as possible. And your job is not to lobby for an outcome. I think activism is important and politics are important, but that cannot be the job of the journalists, because once the journalists start seeing themselves as activists, then no one can understand what's going on, because that baseline of information has been completely warped by the political, leanings of the journalists. And that's what's happened, by the way. When the journalism is activism, then it just becomes impossible to know what to do. So I think that's a broader change than just a change in Israel. And it's one that we have to think about as we kind of interact with these stories coming out of Israel, and as we interact with stories coming out of any aspect of the world, and even inside American society. The drivers of what once was called news coverage are very different than what they were. And many institutions that existed to serve one purpose 20 or 30 years ago do not serve the same purpose today. And it can be confusing because they often have the same name, right? Something might call itself the press, or something might call itself human rights. And there are other examples, but they're not doing the same thing in 2022. They're playing a different game, and I think many of us are not yet aware of it.
So let me propose a hypothetical situation. Congratulations. I'm appointing you now to be Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Congratulations. What do you think would you do differently? And I know it's not a fair question. However, I'm interested to know what would you do differently to improve Israel's image in the press and generally speaking?
Thank you for that appointment. I'm not interested in the job, so but I do appreciate it, and good luck finding another candidate. I think that there are aspects of Israeli PR that can be improved, and I'm speaking, I think, with a certain measure of understatement. Often things are very confused here. There are different people making Israel's case. There's no agreed upon story, and there's kind of a mess of different narratives. I think part of the problem is that Israel itself no longer is sure what its story is. I think we knew 20, 30 years ago what our story was, and it was that old Israeli story where, about Zionism and then the kibbutz and the return to Israel and an eventual peace agreement with the Arab world. That was very important, and that was always part of the plan. If you ask, mainstream Zionists, that's always what people thought would happen. But that's really kind of crashed against the rocks of reality over the past 20 years, leaving Israelis with an unclear idea about what their own story is. So if I were the foreign minister, I would try to kind of think deeply about that, maybe call together the best minds in the country, and not just for purposes of PR, but for purposes of, Israel's own internal sanity, try to think about what our story is. What are we doing here right now? What is our plan? What's the goal of our state? In some ways we've been so successful that the goal has kind of become muddied. So I would do that. I would certainly put, very smart people in charge of PR, but I would also, I think, acknowledge, and this is a difficult one to swallow, I think sometimes, that we're not going to get very far with PR. I think that the obsession with Israel and the hostile narrative that we're seeing is not really about Israel, or it pretends to be about Israel, and Israel is certainly the target of it. But this is a narrative that serves other purposes. It's a way of understanding the world, and that's what hostile narratives about Jews have always been. They've never really been about Jews. And I think that if you took Jews in Germany in the 1930s and you gave them great PR people to explain that they're not manipulating the financial markets and they're not, trying to manipulate German politics for their own gain, that wouldn't have mattered, right? Because the story isn't, factual. It's not that kind of story. It's different. It's a different kind of story. It's a story that uses Jews to illustrate problems on earth. And even if we have the best PR conceivable, even if we have 100 Oxford educated, spokeswomen making our case and the smartest foreign minister in the world, these problems aren't really going to go away. And I think that we have to acknowledge that there's a problem. We have to know kind of what drawer in our brain to put these stories in. We have to deal with it to the extent possible, and we have to make sure that we're concentrating most of our efforts and abilities on improving reality and not improving stories. We have a country that needs to be built. We have a country that can be better than it is. There's a lot that can be done, and I would put most, if not all, of our efforts there in the arena of reality, which is where Zionism has always been successful.
This is very interesting. I think it's also pretty innovative in the approach of Hasbara, the approach to Hasbara. So recently, Jewish National Fund USA slammed Amnesty International's dishonest report on Israel. I'm wondering, how do you think that all these so-called humanitarian organizations became so biased?
It's a great question. But just to get back to something you just said about innovation, I don't think that what I'm saying is actually innovative. And I think that actually it's a kind of a gut instinct of Zionism. And I think a great example of it is JNF, because that's an organization that builds, right? You can just look at the JNF website and you can see all the amazing stuff that the organization is doing in reality. Not wasting a lot of time fighting these narrative battles, which I think can't really be won. Building the country. Can we build a school? Can we pave a road? Can we build a reservoir? Can we help this kid? Can we help that kid? Can we build a hospital in an Arab town? What can we do? What can we do? Truthfully, we can do a lot. And JNF has always known that, which is one of the great things about the organization. But getting back to the negative, what I think has happened to the human rights organizations is what's happened to a lot of other organizations over the past 20 years or so, which is that they've been hollowed out by very extreme activists and repurposed. So organizations like Amnesty International, which meant one thing in the 70s, right, when they were fighting for Soviet dissidents or people imprisoned by terrible regimes. People still think of it that way. They still have a kind of positive association with that organization. When today, what it is it's an organ of the hard left, pursuing kind of ideological fantasies that come out of the world of the left. And one of the boogeymen of the hard left, since the 70s, since the 60s, maybe is the state of Israel, which has always been for the kind of post-colonial crowd a symbol of what's wrong in the world. It's a militarized, Western colonial project, and people like the people who staff Amnesty, have inherited those ideas, and they're pursuing them. They're using their organization, and they're using the term human rights as a weapon to pursue their politics. So the organizations can't be taken at face value, right? An organization, just because an organization says that what it's doing is human rights, doesn't mean that's what they're doing. And I think that term is a very powerful term. No one wants to argue with it because no one wants to be against human rights. Who's against human rights? So it's kind of an incontrovertible position. I'm a human rights organization. No one will argue with me, but that's, human rights is a very complicated question. I think the only human rights organization of any significance in my immediate geographical vicinity is the Israeli Army. That's the organization that protects my human rights, which isn't to say that they don't violate other people's human rights here and there, but that's the only organization that protects my human rights as an Israeli Jew living in Jerusalem. They would never call themselves a human rights organization, but in the real world, it is. So things are more complicated, and I don't think we need to kind of stand up and salute every time an organization claims to represent human rights, just like I think we don't need to stand up and salute every time an organization claiming to be the press says something, because many organizations claiming to be the press are the same activists who are running the human rights organizations. It's the same people with the same ideas, and they've created a kind of information bubble where the journalists who are activists quote the human rights experts who are also activists, and they have a kind of very powerful and coherent story that's completely nonsensical, but obviously something that a lot of people want to hear.
And in order to feel good about themselves, obviously.
Yeah, you want to be on the side of, yes, absolutely. I think that's a good point, actually. I mean, I think that most people aren't motivated by evil. They don't want to do something bad. They're not like secretly, hoping to see the death of Jewish people. They want to feel like they're on the side of what's just, and they want to do that with as little price to themselves as possible. That's what most people really want. And this story is a way to do it, right? Because if you really thought about human rights as an American, or even a Canadian, or if you as a Westerner, and if you really kind of looked at your own society and asked what you can do, that would require a major sacrifice of you. People would rather not. The obsession with Israel allows you to feel like you're doing something just, allows you to kind of position yourself as being on the right side with no price to you at all. I mean, if anyone pays the price, it will be Jews in Israel. Whatever, there's not very many of us, and most of the people in the human rights world have never met any of us, or Jews in the diaspora who are really feeling the heat of this anti-Israel campaign. I think more than Israelis are. I think the campaign to demonize Israel is really felt much more by Jews in the diaspora, and I think, in fact, that it's aimed at Jews in the diaspora. I don't think it's really about Israel. I think it's a different kind of campaign entirely, and that's why I am grateful for the ability that you have as well to just interact with Israel directly in Israel, and I'm able to tune out this kind of poisonous narrative much more easily than someone can if you're in New England.
Yeah, that's very true. I agree with you very much about that. So you touched upon it a little bit before, but so what do you think organizations like Jewish National Fund USA, what role can we play in improving the overall perception of Israel?
I think that it's there are things that can be done on the PR front, but I really wouldn't. Not everyone likes it when I say this, but I really think that our strength is in the real world. And if we look at Herzl, going back to Herzl, 120 years ago in Vienna, he senses that the position of the Jews can't be rescued. And he's hearing all these stories about Jewish influence and Jewish evil. And he's an upwardly mobile, assimilated Jew. He doesn't circumcise his kids. He has a Christmas tree at home, and he thinks that assimilation is what's in store, and he thinks that's a good thing. And then these stories, these very powerful and disturbing stories, start kind of reaching his ears, and he doesn't waste time running around trying to change the narrative. He doesn't found an organization to kind of fight the PR battle for Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He comes up with a completely different plan, and his plan is crazy, or so it would seem had it not worked. And we're both sitting in the result of his plan, and his plan was to change reality. And you know, we were going to do something completely different. We were going to get in our convertible and ride off into the sunset and do something else. And it was going to happen in the real world. And remarkably, it happened. And that's where our strength lies. And that's where the strength of Israel lies. And that's where the strength of JNF always has been. And I wouldn't get diverted too much by narrative warfare. It's very seductive. It's very disturbing. I also, of course, find it quite disturbing, which is why I've written about it. But I think we need to be able to compartmentalize it, understand that it's a problem, not take it too seriously as a portrayal of reality, and focus our efforts on building the best country that we can. That's what we can do. Unlike the narrative battle, it's something where we can actually be successful, and it's something that, if we are successful, will really benefit from the results of these projects. And I don't think I'm telling JNF USA anything that it doesn't inherently know already, because I think that's really the instinct of the organization, as it should be.
But thank you for that. I think you kind of like confirming what we are feeling that we are doing, and it's not by accident that JNF, Jewish National Fund, was born with the declaration of Herzl on the 5th Jewish Congress in Basel. So there is, yeah, absolutely, it's all related. How would you describe your journey so far?
That's a great question. I came when I was 17. This was 1995, and I originally intended just to be here for a year. It was supposed to be a year between high school and college, and I'm still here, and it's been 27 years. I look back on the 17-year-old version of myself who decided to come here, and I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking, but I do know that I made the right decision. I've never looked back, and actually, as time goes on, I've become more and more convinced that it was the right decision. I don't know how I made it when I was 17, because it certainly wasn't a conscious decision about the direction of the Jewish people or where the diaspora would be in 2022. None of that was present in my mind at all. I think I just love the country. I came here, and there's an electricity in the country that is totally absent in in the suburbs of Toronto where I grew up, and there's a real dynamic character to Jewish life, and it's not necessarily a religious character. Judaism is a million different things here. It's going to the supermarket and buying something, and talking Hebrew with the cashier or ordering pizza, and it's also going to synagogue and going to a university in Hebrew and paying your taxes. And that's Jewish life, and I just love that. I love that about the country. And basically, the second I set foot here, I knew that I was staying. And I've had a pretty, it's been a pretty wild time over the past 26 years, and I've written about it, about some parts of it. I served in the army in South Lebanon, and I've been through all kinds of, ups and downs here, as you have. Of course, it's a roller coaster, and the national life of the country hasn't quite turned out like I expected when I came here in the 90s. I thought that peace was about to happen. That was my assumption, and that hasn't panned out. And yet I still think that this is just an incredible story. And my rose-tinted glasses have been off for a long time, and I can really see many of the flaws of the country, and I report them. And I think that's my job. But the more time I spend here, the more I become convinced that it's an absolutely incredible story. It's a kind of miracle. It should never have happened. And it did, and it revolutionized Jewish life. And it's the reason that we can look out at these, poisonous stories taking hold and really kind of moving into the mainstream in the West. And we can always know, even if we choose not to live here, we know that this place exists. And although these stories echo other stories that we've heard in different periods of Jewish history, and although I think many of us have a sense that much less has changed than we thought, things haven't got as good as we thought. But the revolution in Jewish life was successfully executed by Herzl, by Ben-Gurion, by the JNF. And here we are. And I'm grateful, not just for the existence of the country, but I'm grateful for having blundered into it at 17 and having been smart enough to stay.
Well, Matti, I want to thank you so much for not only your time, but your wisdom. And I think that you have such an important role sitting on this bridge between Israel and diaspora Jews and American Jews in particular. And your voice, Hans, is so important for us to be able to convey to our JNF supporters. So I want to, on behalf of JNF, Jewish National Fund USA, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
I want to thank you also for such great questions and for having me, and also for the great work that JNF USA is doing, thanks to Ken and Nancie, of course. We should mention them again, specifically for the great work that they're doing as part of the generally great project that JNF USA has been involved in for so many decades. Your success is our success, and I hope that we can meet again in person.
Me too.
Friends, sponsors, members of our local JNF USA Board of Directors, and all our guests and new supporters, thank you for joining us tonight. Congratulations again, Nancie and Ken, for all the wonderful work that you have done and continue to do. You are truly making this world a better place. And I know I'm not just speaking for me, but for all the people that have joined us this evening. This concludes our wonderful event this evening. Thank you so much.
יש באדמה, חם לי בנשמה, כשאני רואה אותה כבר אין לי נשימה. איזו בחורה, גוף נוטף זהה, משתוללת ורוקדת כולה מסביבה. הנה אני ים, קצב מטורף, כל הרחבה בוערת ואני נשרף. כמה היא יפה, איך היא מטריפה, ואני נמשך אליה כמו אל תוך סופה. איזו מסיבה, כמה אהבה, וכולם עפים, וכולם יפים, אין אחד שלא כן כאן מאתונה עד אילת. איזו מסיבה, כמה אהבה, וכולם עפים, וכולם יפים, אין אחד שלא כן כאן מאתונה עד אילת. יש באדמה, חם לי בנשמה, כשאני רואה אותה כבר אין לי נשימה. בת מהמזרח, יופי של מלאך, כל החברים שלי נפלו אצלך בפח. איזו מסיבה, כמה